This video documents a 2-week residency at Bodhi Khaya in the Western Cape of South Africa. It is also a form of practice-based research. In this project, making is used not only to produce work, but as a method of inquiry. My studio practice is process-based. I start from materials, mostly organic ones, vegetable skins, plant fibers, papers made from what grows nearby. I work without a predetermined outcome. I respond to what the material allows, what it resists, what it suggests. Failure is a source of discovery rather than a setback. Over time, my practice has moved away from contained formats toward forms that are open to change, works that shrink, warp, fade, and continue to transform after they are made. My material is never passive. The sensitivity of my hands is as much a tool as anything else in the studio. Tactility is how I think. The residency offered an opportunity to relocate this way of working into a living environment, where material no longer meant only fibers and papers, but an entire ecosystem, plants, animals, and weather. I treated it as an experiment. What happens to process, authorship, and outcome when making enters this expanded field? The central question of this project is therefore not how to make work about a place, but what happens when making becomes a process of corresponding with a place. What I found was this: when making becomes correspondence, authorship disperses, attention becomes the method, and the work shifts from object to event. The residency did not introduce a new method. It made visible something that was already present in my practice, but in a much narrower frame. In the expanded field of the residency, authorship became more widely distributed, and the transformation of the work was driven by forces of a different scale, speed, and complexity than in the studio. This was the first image I saw when I discovered Bodhi Khaya. Bodhi Khaya is an annual artist residency in the Western Cape of South Africa. It was founded in 2021 by a group of artists who felt there were too few residencies that allowed direct engagement with the land. The residency is set within old-growth forests, fynbos, and regenerating landscapes, including protected milkwood trees that are considered sacred in this region. Each year, up to 10 artists are invited to come and make work in and with this environment. The philosophy of the residency is explicit. The land is not a resource, but a collaborator. Artists are asked to listen, to respond, and to create in dialogue with plants, soil, weather, and the ecological and colonial histories carried by the landscape. As the residency states, art here is a force for renewal, capable of restoring not only ecosystems, but also our collective sense of belonging to the earth. I applied together with Karen Stander, a fine artist based on a farm in the Western Cape. Karen's practice moves between painting, drawing, and immersive wire installations, structures that explore shelter, grief, and regeneration, inspired by the communal nests of sociable weavers. She brings structure and architecture, I bring process and dissolution. A joint residency offered us a rare opportunity. We could immerse ourselves in a natural environment in a spirit of attentive exploration, not to produce a predetermined body of work, but to see how our practices might change when shaped by the same place, the same materials, and the same conditions. We came with questions, not answers. How can we listen to land, not only aesthetically, but ethically? What forms of slowness and attention can guide a collaborative practice? What might emerge from shared presence, shaped by what we find and what finds us. Before the residency began, I spent a week at Karen's farm in the Western Cape. It was the first time we had met in person. We had collaborated once before, a digital work for an online exhibition, combining a photograph of one of my mushroom installations with Karen's charcoal drawing of a forest. We knew how our practices could speak to each other, felt an alignment of sensibilities. But making something together at a distance is different from working alongside another person, reading how they move, how they make decisions, how they respond when a material refuses. The farm week was a way of finding out, quietly through working with local materials, whether the collaboration we had imagined would actually work. Karen's farm sits in the same landscape we were about to enter more deeply. The Western Cape, its specific plants, light and ecological character, already familiar to her in ways they weren't yet to me. I was the outsider. That asymmetry turned out to be generative rather than problematic. She knew the land, I came to it without assumptions. By the time we arrived at Bodhi Khaya, we had established a way of being alongside each other in the work, not mirroring each other, but attuned. The Blomerus forest, which forms part of Bodhi Khaya's landscape, is not wilderness in any simple sense. It is a place of old growth and active regeneration, indigenous forest remnants alongside degraded land that is slowly being restored. It carries history, ecological, colonial, cultural. The wounds and the medicines, as Bodhi Khaya's own philosophy puts it, are present in the same ground. At its heart is the ancient milkwood forest, Xeroxylon inerme, believed to be over 1,000 years old and one of the few remaining indigenous forests in South Africa. These trees are protected by law and in many communities considered sacred. To walk among them is to move through a landscape with its own memory, its own claims, its own authority. I arrived as an outsider in a landscape whose histories were not mine. That position shaped how I worked, with restraint, with attention, and with the awareness that I was moving through a place I could observe but not fully understand. The residency's philosophy gave that intention a framework. For us, this did not mean repairing ecosystems, but repairing a relationship, restoring attention, sensitivity, and a sense of belonging to the living world. Following Merleau-Ponty, philosopher David Abram describes perception as the ongoing interchange between my body and the entities that surround me, a reciprocal relationship between perceiver and perceived. We began to understand the residency as a practice of this kind of attention, not looking at a landscape, but learning to be addressed by it. The question the forest posed from the first day was not what to make, but how to be present. Anat Singh writes about the arts of noticing, paying attention to the small interactions through which life continues in damaged landscapes. The residency became an exercise in this kind of attention, not deciding in advance what to make, but noticing what the place allowed. What does it mean to work with a living ecosystem without exploiting it? To take materials without extracting? To make something ephemeral and leave it, knowing it will change, decay, return to the soil? The forest began answering these questions almost immediately, not in words but in offers. What we noticed determined what was possible. A looped branch suggested weaving fibers into it. The quality of light through the canopy suggested transparency and fragility. Wind determined what could hold and what could not. We learned to read these not as obstacles or accidents, but as instructions, the place participating in the work's decisions. What we were learning in the forest was first how to perceive, then how to notice, and only then how to make. This is what it means in practice to treat the land as a collaborator, not a metaphor but a method, letting the site's specific conditions, its textures, rhythms, resistances, and generosities shape what gets made and how and where. In this sense, making becomes a form of correspondence, not imposing form onto matter, but responding to what the world offers. As Tim Ingold writes, to correspond with the world is not to describe it or represent it, but to answer to it. We went out each morning on foot, foraging and observing. The question of what was permitted to take was present from the start. Nothing that would leave a visible wound, nothing scarce or vulnerable, but abundant plants, invasive species, or what the forest had already shed. The kitchen offered another source: orange peels, leftover papadums, materials rescued from the bin before they disappeared. These constraints turned out to be generative. Working with what the forest offered and what the kitchen discarded, rather than materials chosen freely in advance, produced unexpected results. Materials we would not normally have chosen began to suggest their own possibilities. Jane Bennett writes that things have the capacity not only to block human intentions, but also to act as forces, with tendencies of their own. In this context, the materials were not simply used, they were part of the decision-making process. Playfulness was central. We worked without aim in the conventional sense, without a finished form in mind, without a brief to fulfill. The improvisation musician Stephen Nachmanovich writes that improvisation is not the absence of structure, but a different relationship to it. That describes what we were doing. The structure was the place, the materials, the time of day, the weather. Within those constraints, everything was open. Around the residency house, I made a different kind of intervention, writing words with the contents of used tea bags. Hope, trust. The residency community could watch these words change over time as wind and rain blurred and slowly dissolved the letters. The ephemerality was the point. These words, like the feelings they named, were present but not permanent, vulnerable to the weather, capable of disappearing. We also learned new techniques from other artists at the residency: how to make charcoal from forest wood, how to produce paper from mushrooms and plant fibers. These shared learning moments shifted the residency from individual practice into something more like a community of making, knowledge moving between practitioners as easily as materials. My hands were constantly engaged. The tactility I rely on in the studio, the sensitivity to how a material wants to move, where it resists, where it yields, translated directly into this context, but at a different scale and with unfamiliar materials. I had to learn to read a new material vocabulary, outside and changing light and wind. Tim Ingold describes making as a process of following materials rather than imposing form on them. This was exactly how the work developed, through response, adjustment, and negotiation, rather than execution of a plan. There were failures, works that collapsed before they were finished, structures that could not hold against the weather, ideas that the materials simply refused. One example was a drawing machine. charcoals hanging from threads, set in motion by the wind to leave marks on the surface below. We never found the right balance between the force of the wind, the weight of the tools, and the marks we hoped for. So we left the installation as it was and invited the other artists to make the marks themselves. The failure became a different kind of work. Karen later realized the drawing machine at large scale, in a forest near her home. What the residency had proposed, her landscape eventually answered. These were not setbacks but information. The forest telling us something about what was possible here, what was appropriate, what it would and would not support. Failure was part of the conversation. Andrew Pickering calls this the dance of agency, the back and forth between intention and material behavior. The maker acts, the material responds. The maker adjusts, the material pushes back. Karen and I developed a working rhythm that was less about dividing tasks than about following separate lines of attention that occasionally converged. At times we worked side by side on the same piece. At others we went our separate ways through the forest, each following a different impulse, reconnecting later to share what we had found or made. Collaboration between Karen and me operated at every level, not only in the making but before it. Which plants were worth harvesting for a basket? Where in the forest to place a work? We decided together to avoid the most spectacular areas, the ancient milkwood groves, choosing instead quieter, less dramatic parts of the forest. The intention was that the work should not borrow from the extraordinary. If it had presence, it would have to find it on its own terms. Soon it stopped making sense to ask whose piece was whose. Karen would enter a form I had begun, I would alter something she had placed. The work was happening between us, not inside either of us. Authorship was not located in a single person. It emerged in the space between two people, between hands and materials, between intention and response. This wasn't a problem to solve, but a condition to inhabit. As Grant Kester suggests, in collaborative art, meaning emerges through interaction itself, through what he calls a process of dialogical exchange. Collaboration with the place operated differently, less negotiated, more responsive. The forest did not collaborate in the way humans collaborate through intention or agreement. It presented conditions. A branch at a particular height, a root system that created a natural enclosure, a shaft of light that moved through the afternoon and changed what a piece looked like from hour to hour. Responding to these felt less like making decisions and more like having conversations in a language that wasn't words. Anat Singh describes such relationships as forms of entanglement, situations in which humans and non-humans shape each other's possibilities without shared intention or control. Working in the forest felt like this, not collaboration in the human sense, but a process of being entangled in conditions that shaped what could be made. Karen Barrett extends this idea further still, arguing that entities do not pre-exist their relationships, but are formed through them. The collaboration did not simply produce work, it reshaped how I understood my role within the work, as someone working within a set of relationships that make the work possible. The group of 9 artists provided another collaborative layer. Shared meals, shared observations, watching how others approach the same landscape differently. A filmmaker, performance artist, a sculptor, each bringing a different set of questions to the same place. These exchanges were informal but generative, shifting how we saw our own work and what we thought was possible. One spontaneous collaboration with a bioplastic artist produced something I hadn't yet found a way to make alone. A vessel formed from pier slices, my material, my form, covered in bioplastic colored green with spirulina. I had been thinking about introducing natural pigments into my vessels without knowing how to approach it. Here the question resolved itself through collaboration. The vessel remained edible in principle. Made at the residency house and left there, its disappearance a matter of time and whatever finds it first. The vegetable papers I had made at home from locally gathered plant materials became a shared site of experimentation. I had brought them with the intention of working into them with Karen, but the open atmosphere of the residency made that containment feel artificial. The papers were laid out and handled, other artists were drawn to them. Each participant worked into a single sheet using techniques specific to their own practice: stitching, cutting, rubbing, marking, embedding. This was the beginning of a project that would travel beyond Bodhi Khaya, not as a single work accumulating layers from place to place, but as a structure for repeated collaboration, a seed for further relational work planted here. What travels from place to place is not a single artwork, but a collaborative framework that is reactivated under new conditions. The works were not displayed, they were placed in hollows, around tree trunks, suspended between branches. Many blended so closely into their surroundings that they felt grown rather than made, waiting to be discovered rather than presenting themselves. But not all the works sought camouflage. A curtain of flex fibers marked the entry to the installation, visible, deliberate, a threshold between the ordinary forest and what lay within. Other works introduced a different tone. A rescued papadam, salvaged from the kitchen bin, became a handbag hanging from a branch. Humor had its place here too. Close to the path, two masks hung watching, one made from dried pear slices, one from yellow leaves. Playful, but not entirely comfortable. Seen at night, the works became something else. The transparency and fragility that defined them in daylight gave way to shadow and silhouette, a different kind of presence. The same materials read entirely differently by darkness. The boundary between artwork and environment was never fixed. Material placed in a living system becomes part of that system, subject to its conditions and its time frames. Transformation began quickly. Overnight, the mushroom paper vessels closed, their edges curling inward. They did not open again. The work was already responding in unexpected ways. Some objects turned fast into nourishment for animals. Then it rained. Some pieces held, some sagged and started to disintegrate, some collapsed entirely. What the rain did to the installations was not damage, it was continuation. In Tim Ingold's words, every material is a becoming. The materials responded to the environment they were part of, doing what organic matter does when it gets wet, when it softens, when it begins to return. We had made things designed to disappear. This was the disappearing beginning. The installations were less objects than processes unfolding over time, shaped as much by weather and decay as by our initial actions. 3 months later, a fellow artist returned to the site. On the last day of the residency, the other artists walked through the installations together. I had hoped for interaction, touching, engaging, moving through the work with their bodies. Instead, phones came out. The installations became subjects for photography rather than encounters. I asked them after a while to put the phones away, to use their hands instead. Some did. The reticence didn't disappear entirely, but something shifted. And I was aware even then of a certain irony, that I too had reached for a camera. This entire film is that reaching, another way the work continues. On impulse, 2 days before the end of the residency, I invited the drag artist Luke Rudman to walk through our forest installation and interact with it. The scenes shown here are from a 25-minute edited video of the performance. Drag reveals identity as visibly constructed rather than natural. Placed in the forest, this exaggerated visibility made explicit something true of any human presence here, that we never fully belong. We are all, in different ways, outsiders in this landscape. By entering, touching, smelling, displacing, mimicking, the performer is drawn into the installation. Curiosity becomes touch. Touch becomes participation, until the boundary between visitor and work begins to blur. The installation shifts from a quiet, almost camouflaged intervention to something relational, not only something to be discovered, but something to be questioned, played with. Drag and the installation were doing something similar. Both were about transformation, about testing what belongs and what does not. The forest becomes a stage and collaborator. What belongs in a landscape is no longer self-evident. The idea was mine. What unfolded was not. It became a collaboration between performer, videographer, artworks, and forest, none of them the sole author. What Jane Bennett would call an assemblage, a temporary coming together of human and non-human forces in which authorship is distributed and unstable. Making land art made me confront a question I had not fully faced before. Do we want to leave traces? And if so, why? The installations at Bodhi Khaya were designed to disappear. Organic materials returning to the soil, nothing permanent, nothing that would last longer than a few weeks or months. That was a conscious ethical position, working with the forest without claiming it, making without marking. And yet, documentation exists. This video exists. The impulse to record and preserve what was meant to disappear was present throughout, in tension with the work's own logic. The other artists had reached for their phones. In making this film, so did I. The installations were temporary, but their documentation allows them to persist in another form. This raises the question, where does the work actually reside? In the temporary installation, in its documentation, or in the traces left in those who made and encountered it? Months later, during a community building week with OCA graduates in Lisbon, I finally understood. Bodhi Khaya had not fundamentally transformed my practice. The surrender of control, the working without predetermined outcome, the attentiveness to what the environment offered, these were not new ideas to me, but experiencing them at this scale, immersed in this landscape and in close collaboration, allowed me to see the underlying logic of my practice much more clearly. It also opened a new direction, the possibility of applying the same methods directly in a landscape beyond the studio. As Alvan Noe argues, art is finally a way to understand our organization and inevitably reorganize us. The deeper question is whether I fully trust what I already do. The paper project that continued in Lisbon was one form that residency thinking took beyond Bodhi Khaya. I brought a fresh set of papers made from organic materials, and a new group of artists worked into them, adding a different layer of geography and a different set of sensibilities to the material. Each iteration of the project reflects where it happens and who is present. The papers do not accumulate into a single growing work, they form a family of distinct but related objects, each rooted in a specific place and community. Unlike the forest installations, which were left in place and disappeared, this work travels and continues to grow through the hands of other people. In this way, it no longer exists as a single object, but as a process distributed across places, people, and time. A collage made during the same week used plastic fragments collected on a nearby beach. Like my vegetable works, it is made from undervalued or discarded matter, exploring translucency and fragility. At first glance, it appears organic, like shed skin or a membrane. The forest works in South Africa were left to be reabsorbed into the landscape. This piece removes harmful material from the environment. The same attitude of care, differently directed. The residency showed me a way to continue my work across different places, materials, collaborations. The residency ended with a forest fire. On the last day, flames erupted close to where we were staying. Firefighters arrived. One of the artists joined them on the ground. We watched from a place we had spent 2 weeks treating as a collaborator, a teacher, a space of reverence. During those 2 weeks, immersed in responding to what the forest offered, its dangerous side had retreated to the back of my mind. The fire, in its terrible beauty, brought both sides back into view. It became clear that collaboration with the living system does not imply harmony or benevolence. It means working within a system whose conditions we cannot control and which does not exist for us. Donna Haraway's concept of making kin, forming unexpected alliances across species, materials, and differences, reframes collaboration not as a human methodology, but as a condition of being in the world with others. Her call to stay with the trouble felt after the fire less like a philosophical question and more like a practical necessity. To remain present within complexity and uncertainty, rather than retreat to simpler narratives of nature as either benign or hostile. Immersion in this landscape did something I had anticipated, but not to this extent. The daily walks, the slow attention, the absence of screens and schedules, something in me became available that isn't always available in the studio. More open, more playful, less defended against surprise. Whether that depth was specific to this ancient forest, or whether any sustained immersion in a living environment would have produced the same effect, I still don't know. But the experience made visible how strongly attention is shaped by environment, and how different kinds of places make different kinds of thinking and making possible. What Bodhi Khaya left in me is not a set of techniques, but a quality of attention, and the question whether it is possible to bring that quality of listening back into the studio, into daily practice, into work made alone.